All right, so we are recording Thursday, May 13th. We're here to demo work done in Comet sprint number 3, and we have Tom to guide us through some of the activities that were done in this 2-week sprint.
Thanks. So the main thing that we slated for as a goal for this sprint was to sort out some metadata configuration. So the hope was that we would have separate configurations per campus and be driving how object metadata gets stored, indexed, and various parts of the application, mainly the input forms for managing individual object metadata, have those kinds of features drive from that config. So that was our main goal for this sprint. Some of those things got done. We do have a metadata config. Chrissy was really helpful in providing us a sort of bare bones UCSB metadata config file using the community M3 specification, and that we translated into a more basic config that Hyrax uses out of the box, and we were able to get that in at the object layer, but unfortunately we're not showing a lot of real application behavior keying off that. So you can see the form still just says title. We have a couple of other metadata fields that on the UCSB side we were hoping would be picked up automatically by the config, but we're not seeing that just yet. On the other hand, we do have a good strategy for doing the cross-campus approach, and as soon as we have a metadata config that represents the UCSD side, then I think we should be able to have the application set up keying off of those configs freely across in cross-campus deployments, which is a big deliverable for us. So there's not a lot, unfortunately, to demo on the metadata side, but there was quite a bit of progress made behind the scenes. In keeping with that theme, we had some work from last sprint that we did slate to wrap up in this sprint related to easy ID minting. And that work did get done. So the scope here was really to have backend code in place so that when we figure out where we're going to trigger easy ID minting, arc minting for the objects, that we have well-tested code that does that job, gets the ID from the upstream service, pushes the metadata to it, and then repopulates the ID fields in Comet based on the newly minted arc. The deliverable that we scoped there is done, but it is also not a UI-facing deliverable. And I'll say, I said something just a second ago about when we find out where we're going to trigger that ID mint. I'll say more about that in a moment. But that's Another thing that I guess I just want to claim as an accomplishment for the team, but sort of regretfully say there's not really much that I can demo for you here. I think it would be like a ice shell into a Ruby console and run some code, and an ID pops out. And I'm not sure that that's a useful exercise for us. So we do have Easy ID integration. It is configured on the staging and production systems. We're using the Easy ID test account on the temporary review apps. So that's a lot that got figured out, but we still don't have an answer about when we're actually going to when in the object lifecycle we're actually going to want to mint those IDs, and how that will vary across different kinds of deposit processes. So that takes me to a third line of work that we pursued this sprint. The idea was sort of that we'd get some initial conceptual work done around the idea of object lifecycle, and particularly around workflow. So this is when I deposit an object to Comet, what process do I want it to go through? What are the states that it will encounter between, well, not necessarily between anything, but during its overall life cycle. And then what roles are involved, not specific individuals or users, but what roles are involved in moving the object through its life cycle. So we had, I don't know, 10 or 15 user stories that spoke to this, and we did an exercise where we sort of went through them and identified the states that we could name that the user stories seemed to either explicitly called out or seemed to assume would exist. And then out of that, well, we did sort of a second pass to figure out the roles. And then out of that, Gabriella worked up this diagram, which is still, I think, very work in progress. We're continuing to have discussions about what the separate workflows might be, and how they'll be managed across the campuses. But I think this diagram is really useful in getting a sense for the broad scope of what we're up against. So so this speaks to states like in digitization, ready for metadata description, and then transitions like digitization completed, and like, so this is a flow through this diagram. And the sort of the larger, paler boxes are grouping these states and transitions by the roles that are involved in them. I think that's sort of a loose grouping based on our discussions, and it's possible that, well, I think it's even probable that this diagram represents the bones of more than one workflow as such. The other thing that I'd call out about this is that we've had some discussions about how terminal the published, live, and suppressed cycle at the end is, and the ways in which that may not actually reflect the real life cycles of our objects. It may be sort of normal for objects to go back into metadata review as a part of some kind of reconciliation project, or for other kinds of ongoing maintenance or review to be happening after they've reached this is available to the public state. The other thing that I think we're super interested in teasing out a little further is just what it means to be done to begin with. We've sort of talked about it with this published live terminology, and I think we've sort of agreed that that's not all that helpful. That in fact objects might be through this QA process, but not be being pushed out to public interfaces for any number of policy reasons. So we're still sort of teasing out the terminology here. And this is, I think it's worth saying, input for some other configuration-driven behavior that we're expecting to be able to roll out around workflow processes. The initial version of this, I think that this is sort of the next sprint for us, is figuring out an initial version of this that allows individual objects to go through this workflow, for us to configure multiple of them, and for the campuses to be able to select those workflows in some way that feels ergonomic and makes sense to users in the UI. So that's a lot about workflow. Gabriella, do you have anything to add or clarifications that you'd like to drop in at this point? I think this is the most PO work that we've demoed so far.
Yeah, no, this is just like you stated, this is a real big chunk of work to chew off. And I think our stakeholders need to know that a lot of time and energy is going to be put into this so that we can get it right. So, thanks to our metadata specialists, Chrissy and Arwen, we're going to keep them quite busy in the next couple of weeks, helping us get this workflow tweaked and adjusted. This is just a first pass. Trust me, as Tom has explained to you all, we're going to have to probably come up with a couple more diagrams, handful to cover all the different workflow possibilities that we're going to fold into Comet.
Yeah, and I guess there's a couple contextualizing pieces of UI that I can already show. So this is the sort of workflow roles assignment page, and I'm not going to try to do anything here because we haven't set anything up and tested anything in this application. But the basic idea here is that within certain, we'll call them projects, within certain projects, a certain workflow will be applied to objects that are within that project, and then this is like an admin management page for handling what users have what roles within those workflows. So that's this may be slightly grounding, and then I think the other thing let's do, that's the home page. So the other thing is that I think this concept of a administrative set will rename project. So this sort of empty-ish box, I think will represent a pretty major point of access for objects within those workflows. The other, I guess the other piece to note is that the workflows drive this notifications feature. So we have some user stories around the idea of like, when I'm a digitization specialist and I'd like to note that something is ready for metadata, like the lab is done with it and we're pushing it into metadata entry, then I want to be able to move it to that state and have somebody get a notification. That's a feature that would be triggered by this sort of workflow role concept. And likewise, if you had like a student or other sort of process where a staff member is going to do some data entry, create some metadata, and then that's going to go into a QA or review process, then this would sort of drive both the queue and the notifications for these objects are ready for review and these objects are being pushed back for rework or that kind of process. So this is the whole workflow discussion is sort of around how best to configure a pre-existing powerful tool. And I guess I promised that we'd tie it back to the easy ID question. The last but not least thing that these workflow processes trigger is sort of events in the object lifecycle. So one of those events would be minting an external ID or a permanent ID. So the reason why we don't have anything in the code base calling the easy ID code is that at some point that's going to be triggered by one of these workflow transitions, and other behaviors can be triggered in that way as well. Like if you want to change an object's access permissions as part of the publish step, then that's a thing that's another example of behavior that's triggered by the workflow transitions. So yeah, like Gabriella said, this is pretty nascent in the form that we'll have it out in Comet, but a lot of the main work here should be figuring out what we want and configuring it, not writing software to drive these processes. One of the things that we've got with Hyrax is, and one of the driving reasons to select Hyrax was that there's a powerful workflow and notification engine sort of built in that we feel confident about being able to configure in a way that's going to work for, that's going to be really flexible across the campuses. Okay, so I've got one more thing to talk about, which is that during this sprint, there was a community event called, so in the Samvera, formerly Hydra space, there's been a long practice of doing developer events they're frequently called dev congresses. And we've done a couple during, we've done a couple of virtual dev congresses during remote time. So we had one of those early last week, I guess Monday through midday Thursday. So not that early last week, I think that's right. And one of the things that got worked on during that sprint is the underlying engine behind Comet, Hyrax. And we did get a couple of fixes that impacted us. mainly, so we've demoed object deposit before. Mainly, this file detail page is now functioning for us, and this is, I think, kind of exciting because it shows a lot of what's coming for files in general. So I think we're going to talk about this single-use link feature. That the idea behind this, as it's built, is that I'll make a single-use link, and then I'll be able to like pass it to somebody, and that's a one-time download of this object. That's a feature I know that people are interested in, but we're not certain whether it's a Comet feature or not. I think there's an architectural discussion that we'll want to have about that. But the fixity check, I think, is pretty interesting. We're not actually running those on this system yet, but this is where you would see information about does this object match its checksum at deposit time and information like that. Characterization likewise isn't running right now, but it's normal. It would be normal for us to run a characterization process and for some fits XML populated data to show up here. So that would be information like the size of the file, beyond just its file extension, what kind of file it is. So Fitz does a really good job of figuring out, even if you like tell it that it's a .pdf, figuring out that it's not and that it's actually a JPEG or something. So that kind of information, broadly, I guess, technical metadata for the individual files would live here or will live here. These are open tickets to get these features working. And then you can also see that there's sort of an activity log for this file. You can see that I, as Comet admin, deposited it. And that this is a little bit like well, I guess I updated the file set. There's a little bit of an opaque language about these these user activity logs. But the point is that I uploaded this file and I attached it to an object. And I think we'll probably refine the information that goes into these logs as we go.
Tom, I have a question.
Yeah,
is this page driven by a user's role? Because I do see there, edit this file set, delete this file set.
Yeah, that's right. The functions that I have available to me here are driven by what the access control rules for the file are. And I'll say it says file set everywhere. I think we'll probably just make that say file pretty much everywhere. I think that's maybe a terminology discussion, Gabriella. A file set in Samvera terminology is a single file from like an original upload, but then with a bundle of sort of derivatives of various kinds that might be attached to it. So the fits XML that I mentioned before is one of those, but also like a OCR output or a transcript or things like that are auto-generated based on the input file would be attached within a file set here. But the terminology aside, yes, this object has a set of access control rules attached to it, and I have some of these buttons available to me because I'm an admin who has edit access for this file.
Great, thanks.
So yeah, those are that's the sort of overview of what happened in the past 2 weeks. Do we want to talk about what's next, Gabriella?
Sure.
So do you want to talk about what's next?
Yeah, briefly, we are going to, or the team decided that we are going to pause because we all know that sales stuff is happening right now. So our San Diego developers are busy meeting a deadline, a hard deadline for some work. So we have determined to take a pause. That doesn't mean that Comet work will stop. That means that our developers will stop work on development, and that'll give time again for Chrissy and Arwen to focus their attentions on this workflow activity that has to happen. Also metadata, customization of metadata. Those are two things that we'd like to keep our focus on in the next couple of days, because like I said, the sprint isn't necessarily, well, the sprint will end, but work will not. And we will reconvene as a group on May 25th to decide whether we resume our sprints pending our developers situation with the SILS work. Tom, do you have anything else that you want to add?
Yeah, so I can say that on the UCSB side, we are planning to sort of use this time both to put our heads down and move some of that metadata and workflow discussion forward. So I'm hopeful that the outcome of this brief hiatus will be that we have a lot of ready work when we do come back. The other thing that's very, I think, Comet relevant that we'll be working on the UCSB side over the next couple of weeks is looking at our processes for getting content migrated into this system. And I think that will going through that exercise of sort of extracting some content, I think from Alexandria is where we'll probably start, and moving it into the system will help us understand what we sort of need in place just from an object lifecycle standpoint. Just like do we have the kinds of provenance metadata that we feel we need? Are the objects coming over faithfully? Is the descriptive metadata configured right? And that then will give us an opportunity to get some of our local stakeholders involved in a more hands-on way. So that's work that we're hoping to just sort of like carry forward with, or I guess in some sense what we're doing is we're moving it up a bit. And then I think in the meanwhile, there will probably continue to be some light development work. So there's still some parts of this system that are just not wired in because of the sort of early architectural choices that we've made that are different from the back end or from the engine, I guess is the terminology. Hyrax has a slightly different set of ideas about where we'll store content than the broad direction that Surfliner is going, and we're sort of continuing to get things like these fixity checks and file characterizations wired in. So there may be a lot of feature addition just by moving towards compatibility on the development side. So I am sort of hoping, Gabriella, that we'll end up closing a lot of tickets out early in the regroup work cycle from movement that's happening mainly upstream, but that we're driving.
So it'd be more accurate than for me to say that while we won't have official sprint happening, that there's going to be a lot of work happening with, like you said, closing some tickets that are open that we know you can tackle during the off cycle.
Yeah, I think
work.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that we shouldn't split hairs. Like we're stopping the Surfliner work cycle to make space for this emergent sills work. And we've sort of talked about how inevitable those kinds of interruptions seem to be in this cross-campus collaboration, but the impact of that isn't that we're changing our priorities. So I don't think work will stop on this, even though it's not structured through the Surfliner work cycle.
All right. And just one real quick question. I don't know if our stakeholders know what config means, but you mentioned that at the very beginning a couple of times, talking about configs. So can you just give a real quick layman's term?
Sure. So I think there was a couple places where configuration came up. So one is in the metadata, and maybe I'll reshare. Hang on one second. Yeah, so I'll just grab. Yeah, so for the metadata in particular, what we're hoping to do is not have changes to metadata or additions of new metadata models, or like these kinds of what is the schema questions. We're hoping to have those not be code related in a significant way. And another way of saying that is we're hoping to have them be config driven. So we want for metadata experts at one campus or the other, for each campus's deployment, to be able to say, this is the schema that we want to use. We want to give them a tool. That tool right now is these configuration files, which I think both Chrissy and Arwen are comfortable with, since they worked on the specification for these files. But the idea is that a domain expert for the campus will provide the configuration that handles all the details of what makes an object have a certain metadata schema, and that those won't be then requiring developer intervention to roll out. That's a very powerful change from the sort of long-standing practice on both campuses, where developers are mediating metadata specification processes. And that's a very error-prone practice, because it relies on a really clear communication between the metadata experts and the developers to get that work done. So it's a complicated sort of like, have we checked off all the boxes? Can somebody verify that we've checked off all the boxes? Is that person able then to communicate back to the developer about which boxes aren't checked off? So it's a big win for us to have config-driven metadata. So that again was sort of a major theme of this sprint, and this file that you're looking at now, as well as this much smaller one, are outputs of that process as we sort of get the details of that requirement ironed out. Does that help answer your question about on the metadata front?
It does.
And then I'll say that there's a very similar logic with there's slightly less history behind this one. The metadata one in particular, I think, has been a wish list item for both campuses for some time. But the workflow situation is similar, where we want the workflow process to be driven by configuration and not by developer software effort. And that in both cases, the approach we're taking now is to have the configuration tool just be a file that we can validate and load in. But it does present a lot of opportunity for, like, if what we find is that lots of metadata changes are happening, or that lots of workflows need to be generated, that we could start to look at ways of enabling, and right, like either through UI or training or some combination of the two, empowering more people to have control over the ways that workflow and metadata are configured in the system. So the software side goal is to make that not a developer mediated process, so that it can become an expert driven process at each campus.
Thanks. That's for me, that offers a lot of clarity on what's happening behind the scenes. Thank you for that, Tom. And then with that said, I'm looking at the clock and I noticed that it's lunchtime. This is great. This sprint actually, while you expected possibly we wouldn't have much to show, I think you've really demoed a lot. So Great work again by your team, and appreciate all the time and effort spent to make this happen. And we'll get together hopefully in the next couple of weeks to determine where we go from here in terms of fresh sprints coming up. Thank you,
Thanks,
Tom.
Gabriella.